Welcome, welcome, friends. It is Thursday, September the 25th. This is Hurricane Hub Live. I'm Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandages. And tonight on HHL, we've got another jam-packed show for you. Lots to talk about out in the Atlantic Basin. We've got Humberto, now forecast to become a major hurricane this week, and that would make it 3 for 3 hurricanes becoming majors so far this season. And then Imelda, expected to develop soon. We're up to high odds in the short and long range, 24 to 48 hours. And then within the next 7 days, 80 and 90% odds of that developing. Now, models for Imelda have trended toward U.S. impacts, okay? The time frame right now that it looks to be possible would be Monday and Tuesday of next week. It is not a certainty, though, because the steering mechanisms become very complicated as it gets off the southeast coastline later this weekend and early next week. And it's going to also depend on Humberto and how close it is. We may have some interaction between the two systems, which is unusual. It's called the Fujiwhara effect. We're getting into that, too, in this video. We may see that play out. We may not, and how that may impact the trajectory of Imelda. So with a hurricane out there, our third of the season, typically we see our third hurricane. Well, it's not developed into a third hurricane yet, I should say. September the 7th, though, is typically when we see that in regard to climatology. Now, it is forecast to become a major hurricane later this weekend, and usually we see only 3 majors during an entire season. And that third one doesn't typically come around about a month from now, the end of October, October the 28th to be exact. So we may come out, about a month ahead of schedule, depending on how quickly we get to that Category 3 status that's forecast for Humberto. Here's a look at the overall basin. We have 3 systems out there. Only 2 right now are currently named. We do still have Gabrielle that has now gone post-tropical. It is bringing impacts to the Portuguese Azores Islands. We've got Humberto, and then here just to the southwest of it, sitting over land, impacting land right now, is Invest 94L that will presumably become Imelda. In the short term, really. Look at how close in proximity these 2 storms are. They may look really close now. They're actually going to close the gap a little bit as Humberto is forecast to move pretty much due west for the next day or 2 before taking on a more northerly trajectory here. And of course, what will become Imelda will be tracking to the northwest as well, just farther to the west from where Humberto is. And how close they get will determine their proximity and, of course, their interaction that could have a down-the-line impact of where it goes. Here's how it looks on infrared satellite imagery and the data here with Humberto. 60-mile-per-hour winds. When we joined you yesterday, it was just barely a tropical storm. It had just been initiated at 5 p.m. yesterday. Now it has intensified a little bit. Now mid-grade tropical storm at 60 miles per hour. Of course, once it hits 74 greater, we get those. We get it up to a Category 1 hurricane, and that is expected to happen within 24 hours by Friday afternoon. Now it is moving slowly off to the northwest at this time at only 6 miles per hour. A close-up look here. We certainly have had a blow-up of convection wrapping around the center of Humberto, which is interesting because it's been combating pretty strong wind shear. It's been coming out of the west to southwest. Plus, we've got a lot of dry air around it, too, that has been getting entrained into the circulation. But aside from that, much like we saw with Gabrielle, okay, remember when it was just starting to develop, Gabrielle, and it was undergoing a lot of obstacles, and it still managed to hold itself together. Same with Aaron as well. This looks to be doing the same old thing, kind of, shrugging it off and still developing. You can see the flare-up of convection here by colder cloud tops on the infrared satellite, and that's indicated by the shades of white on those clouds. That's the colder cloud top, stronger thunderstorm activity wrapping around the center. Visible satellite imagery certainly shows a more put-together system than what we saw yesterday. We were seeing the exposed low-level center because of the wind shear yesterday. Not so much of that today, although certainly more of the convection is still dislocated northeast of that core, but it is starting to wrap around it. So that's an improvement in terms of its overall organization. And when you switch it up to water vapor, that helps us depict where the dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere is, depicted by the rust color. Not a whole lot. There are some dry air trying to get wrapped into it there, but for the most part, it's fending it off quite well and will likely do even better at it as it moves into a more favorable environment as it tracks again slowly off to the north and west. And down below the hood, the surface of the ocean still very, very warm. in that part of the ocean, so it's got plenty of heat energy to take advantage of as well. So we saw a development yesterday of Humberto, our 8th named storm, pretty much right in line, exactly to the date of last year's 8th named storm. But on climatology, September 9th is typically when we see that. And then once we get Imelda, September the 16th is on average when that occurs. Obviously, we'll be a little bit behind that, but last year it didn't come until September 25th. All right, here's the track of Humberto. Okay, moves very slowly for the next 24 hours, but by tomorrow afternoon, we're already up to 80-mile-per-hour winds, so a Cat 1. And then it builds to the west-northwest, becoming a Cat 3 here as early as Sunday afternoon, maxing out right now in terms of intensity of 120 miles per hour. Now, Gabrielle was also forecast to max out at a Cat 3, and we saw that thing cruise up to a Cat 4, 140-mile-per-hour sustained winds. Overperformance is certainly a possibility and almost at this point expected because Erin moved through this exact same area, and of course that overperformed to a Category 5. Not calling for a Cat 4 or Cat 5 here, but I'm not going to say completely ruling it out. It's not going to impact its track, though. It looks to move to the north and west and head into a similar region to where Erin passed, meaning safely off the eastern seaboard and safely west of Bermuda. In fact, if I put on the track here of Erin, you can see it did start off at a lower latitude and then lift due north. You saw it scraping across just north of Puerto Rico when it was a Cat 5. And then it tracks in pretty much the same direction of what we're expecting Humberto to do here by early next week. So here we are Tuesday afternoon, and it is not too far off the east coast of the U.S. And then you can see Bermuda right there. So the cone is not encompassing any land masses. So its placement within this cone is going to have a big implication on its impact with Imelda. Say it tracks on the far southwestern side of this cone, meaning it's going to be in closer proximity to Imelda. More likely, we see the Fujiwhara interaction happening, meaning it will throw off its trajectory as they dance along a central point. Say it tracks farther to the east-northeast, larger distance in between the two storms, they may act as separate entities with no impact on trajectory. And we see this move on out to sea, and Imelda cruises north into the southeast coast of the U.S. That's in play, and that's what models have been trending towards today. Before we get to Imelda, potential Imelda, likely Imelda, let's once again look at the models here in terms of Humberto. The ensemble plots here have a significant amount that runs south of that forecast cone, placing it closer to Imelda, but the majority, again, inside of that cone, and then they do shoot it on out to sea, safely out to sea. May still brush Bermuda. We'll have to watch for that, but as of right now, the cone does not bring it anywhere close, even though impacts are expected well outside the cone, as you well know. The center of that storm system should steer clear of Bermuda as it looks right now. Over to 94L. This is what we're expecting to become Imelda, probably in the next 24 to 36 hours, as that time frame within 2 days has shot up to 80% now. Within 7 days, it's up to 90%. It is already bringing impacts to areas. The U.S., British Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, over to Dominican Republic, Haiti, squally-type conditions, some gusty winds, heavy rainfall. So already bringing impacts, okay, without a name. It's drifting its way. The center is pinned here from the hurricane center just off the north coast of Haiti. Even though you see all the convection and flare-up here is located well to the south and southeast. Eventually, we'll start to see it wrap around as it builds off to the northwest through the Bahamas, meaning it will bring impacts, even likely before it gets a name, but it will organize as it moves on through that part of the ocean and eventually off the southeast coast. Here's the latest run of our spaghetti plot. So each line here is a different hurricane model. Okay, pretty good consensus taking it off to the west-northwest, tracking it towards Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas, okay? We get up to around, say, parallel adjacent to West Palm Beach, Cape Canaveral, Florida, off the east coast of Florida. It looks to track safely offshore. At this point in time, it builds due north, and then you see it kind of runs into almost an imaginary wall here, and models are split. A handful take it off to the north and west, meaning a landfalling system in the Carolinas, and then several more deflect it, taking a hard right turn east and out to sea. What's causing that kind of is moving on up, slowing down likely, and then splitting off in the other direction. A ridge of high pressure developing. And that, folks, is a little bit worrisome. Because with that there, that means that as it's building to the north, it's going to be slowing on down. And if it does take the landfall scenario here, That means, like we've seen time and again, landfalling storms slowing down and stalling, meaning a massive flood situation is on the table. If it does take that direction, that is something we're going to really focus on. And the Weather Prediction Center has already put out 7-day rain totals that are over a half foot in the Carolinas. And if this scenario plays out, it could double that, okay? I want to show you the noticeable shift that has happened in those computer models in the last 24 hours or so. Let's see if these do pop up here. They should. Last night's model runs were actually much farther to the east and offshore. This morning, they were much farther off towards the west. It looks like we probably just hit the 8 p.m. hour and it actually recycled to today. So I'm not going to be able to show you that here, but I'll tell you it is a significant shift in those areas. Now, let's look at the two models, the GFS and the European, compared here, okay? We're starting to see more agreement among those, which wasn't the case just a couple of days ago. So here are the models, the GFS in the yellow, European in the red. This is Humberto. Pretty good agreement there on location. GFS slightly farther to the north, stronger. European slightly farther to the south, little weaker. Still a hurricane at that point because we're at Sunday already at this point. And then both models, look at the exact location. They're almost right on top of each other 3 days out from now. Sunday, the GFS and Euro indicating a storm, Imelda, having formed by this point in the northern Bahamas. Safely off to the east of the east coast of Florida. Good news. But watch as we go out in early next week. Jump up to Monday. Imelda here, both the GFS and Euro now, shooting it almost due north, projecting it towards the Carolinas with a possible landfall location right along the South Carolina-North Carolina border. As maybe a high-end tropical storm, maybe a hurricane at this point. It could overperform as well. Again, this is untapped ocean here, very warm. In the meantime, we've got Humberto with a little more disagreement in location for the GFS and the European on where that is. European is now much farther to the south. GFS is much farther to the north, but it looks to be enough gap in between these that there may not be much interaction at all. In fact, indicated by these models running here, we don't really see that. They seem to be acting completely separate of one another. If it was Fujiwhara, you would start to kind of see them orbiting around a central point, which would be like around here. So that would probably project Humberto in this general direction and slow down and push it, almost suppressing it a little farther to the south and east, south and west for Imelda. That can still be in play. Models could be off here, but that's what it looks like on here. Builds it inland, and then this is the part here, right? So we talked about the ridging developing over New England. It's depicted here on the European model. Notice it makes landfall, but it doesn't go much farther north. It builds inland to the north and west and then sits and spins over the Carolinas. Not a good sign for a very heavy rainfall event there. And if you remember, if this does make it farther to the north, southeastern Virginia did see plenty of rain just last week. In fact, over a half foot. So ground saturated in a lot of these areas, and that could lead to some more issues on its own. And then we've got Humberto at this point in time, Wednesday, middle of next week. It's still sitting, there's Bermuda right there, sitting just north and west of Bermuda. Pretty good placement, probably a very large storm, probably a very powerful storm at this point in time as well, while Imelda is weakening, but raining itself out over land. And then you see Humberto jet on off, and European just has it all falling apart over the southeast part of the United States. Let's talk a little bit about the Fujiwhara effects, and you're going to hear it a lot more over the next couple of days as we kind of get a better feel for if that's going to be in play or not. It's when two storms interact with one another, okay? If similar size, they can orbit one another from a central point, depending on their proximity. Now, it's going to depend on intensity, too. Usually, the stronger of the two will tend to absorb the weaker one. Doesn't always happen, but if they do pull each other into that central orbit, the stronger one will survive. Doesn't add anything to the stronger one. Doesn't make it more intense. It just, the wind shear is stronger from the stronger storm, so it just destroys the weaker one. Now, some occurrences. There was one in 2023 that was between Rena and Philippe. And then in 2017, Hurricane Hillary and Irwin. 2016, this one was right off the East Coast. So this one is kind of similar area if it was to occur with Hurricane Matthew and Tropical Storm Nicole. And then back to 2005, Wilma and Alpha, when we went into the Greek alphabet at that point. I talked about the Weather Prediction Center's new rainfall outlook for 7 days. This just came out fresh. And it does highlight the potential here for a widespread heavy rainfall flooding event in the Carolinas, eastern Carolina, North Carolina, northeastern South Carolina, and southern southeastern Virginia. Not set in stone, but just to give you a feel for what we may have here, it doesn't really matter if it's an intense storm or not. It could just be a mid-grade tropical storm here, but with tons of tropical moisture. So rainfall, flooding is certainly going to be an impact here if it does take that track to the north and west and is a landfalling storm. If it stays offshore, we'd bring these rainfall totals and put them out over the open Atlantic, maybe clip in the coastal areas, but that would be a better scenario in regard to having a flooding setup there. I will say I think Imelda is going to have a little bit of a tough time interacting or really intensifying quickly, because I think there's going to be a lot of dry air that it's going to have to battle, and even some wind shear as well, because we're going to have an upper level feature sitting over the southeast that'll probably impart some shear on it. So it's not a slam dunk that this thing's going to be like a hurricane coming on shore. It could be a low grade, very disorganized tropical storm and bring this amount of rain. So just keep that in mind. Do not always focus on if it's a tropical storm or if it's category 1 hurricane, 2, 3, 4. Doesn't always matter. All right, out in the Eastern Pacific, we'll end on this. Category 1, Narda. This is the 14th named storm. Was it the 7th or 8th hurricane? Cat 2, again, it was a Cat 2 yesterday, weakened a bit back to a Cat 2, but again, not affecting land, so not a huge deal. All right, here's our basin scorecard. 8 named storms so far in the Atlantic, with Imelda possibly formed. We'll be up to 9. And then we will have 3 hurricanes with Humberto, and then when it becomes a major 3, up against 14, 8, and 3 out in the Eastern Pacific. All right, folks, coming up after a quick break, we got to look back at Hurricane Helene. This is the 1-year anniversary this week of its landfall and its major impacts in the Carolinas. And then we'll talk tropical trivia, the answer from yesterday's trivia question. We'll see you after a quick break.